Good evening, everybody. For our, I think, 15th or so session of Psychosocial Wednesday. Today we have a philosopher, not really, but I see him as a philosopher, as our guest. And I find it, or we find it important that in a field of knowledge, especially where there are no outright accepted epistemology, as for instance in depth psychology, it is important to have different views on different angles on the research topic. And one of the aims of our initiative is to shed more light on those different angles. And one of these angles, namely seeing analytical psychology from the German literary and philosophically viewpoint, especially German classicism and the more modern philosophy as represented by Nietzsche, Stefan Georg, and Ludwig Klages, is represented by Paul Bishop. Paul Bishop is a prolific writer on that subject. He is the chair for modern languages at Glasgow University, and he wrote many books. A couple of them are really cherished. A couple of them are Synchronicity and Intellectual Intuition in Kant, Swedenborg, and Jung. Then my favorite, Jung's Answer to Job, and Analytical Psychology and German Classical Aesthetics, Goethe, Schiller, and Jung. And concerning our topic today, on the Blissful Island with Nietzsche, Jung in the Shadow of the Superman, and his last one, Ludwig Klages and the Philosophy of Life, a Vitalist Toolkit, or Vitalist Toolkit. 2 comments. I live in Munich and I live next to a watering hole, which was a favorite place of Ludwig Klages and his love, Fanny von Reventlow, the Simplicissimus. Paul, you might know it. So every time I pass by, I think of him. So I hand over to you. All the best.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And I'm delighted to know that somebody's thinking about Ludwig Klages. That's excellent. Thank you very much for your invitation to speak tonight. And thank you to everybody for coming along. And nice to see some familiar faces and some familiar names on the screen. So that's nice. I feel even more connected than I would have done talking about Jung and talking about Klages. I've just got a little bit of a PowerPoint that I'm going to share, and that's Paul's going to get that up on the board for us to see. And bingo, there we go. That's lovely. That's just the title to remind me of what we're talking about and who I am. So if we move on to the next one. There we actually get to see some pictures of the guys that we're talking about. Leslie's got a bit of a visual problem. Is you able to fix that for Leslie at all?
I'm sorry, what am I not seeing?
I saw a little chat sign from Leslie saying she couldn't see anything. If it's the handout, Leslie, don't worry, because that's coming in the body of the presentation. So don't worry about that, Leslie, if you couldn't get the handout. I'll send it to you afterwards, so you make sure you've got a copy. You're very welcome. So here we've got the two guys that we're talking about. It's a very different style of photograph from the ones that people would take of themselves today. But the main focus is not going to be on their faces, even though actually Clarke was very interested in faces and the whole tradition of physiognomy, nor on their personalities, but on their ideas and on their contributions that they have to make. But as Bernhard has already alluded to, there is something that brings these two people close together, and that is to do with their geographical proximity. And just if we go to the next slide, they'll remind us of the part of the world that they lived and work in. Jung, as we all know, is there in Küsnacht. Don't have to talk about Jung. Klages comes to the Canton Zurich, comes to Switzerland. Doesn't live very far away, as we'll see. He's actually born in Hanover and does his studies in Munich. In fact, he trains as a chemist. And it's interesting that he has a very, very wissenschaftlich, scientific pathway that he starts on before he goes in this different direction. And one of the reasons why he goes in this different direction is through his time in Munich, and of course, falling in with the Stefan George circle, from which he then separates, and controversially so, and then goes off on a kind of one-man mission, as a graphologist, as a physiognomist, as someone who's interested in keyword Ausdruck, expression, and he ends up living in the Konrad Ferdinand Meyer house, which is, and if we go to the next slide, where you can see there is in Kilchberg. And there you can beautifully see on this little bit of the map just how close the two of them are. Jung on the one side in Küsnacht and Klages on the other side in Kilchberg. And they could have waved at each other. And who knows, maybe they met up in Migros or Co-op in the center of town on Saturdays or something like that. Apart from the fact, probably neither of them did their own shopping. But they were geographically very, very close. And one of the things that interests me is trying to tease out the connections that are there, the proximities, but also the differences, because there is a bit of a gap where the lake is in between Kilchberg and Küsnacht. What is the relation between Jung and Klages? That's really what I want to be focusing on. So if we move on to our next slide. I'm trying to ask this question about what is their Weltanschauung, what is their worldview. I mean, it's one of the greatest words that the German language has given us, and so great that we have to use it in English. And common to both of them, I think, is from this very, very famous woodcut, is this idea that within these thinkers, they're going to take us outside of the ordinary and show us something extraordinary. They're going to take us out of our little petty everyday world, which we can see on the one side, and they're going to show us what happens when we look beyond it, out into the cosmos. And you can see a little bit of the cosmos there with sort of wheels and things and all sort of stuff that's going on in the upper left-hand side there. And of course, that is the cosmos. And I think that both of these thinkers are very, very interested in the idea of what actually is the cosmos and can we find out about it. And in order to get close to this question of what is their Weltanschauung, I just wanted to briefly look at a couple of extracts taken from both of them. So starting with Jung, and that's on the next slide. So just to let you know where these quotations have come from, I'm taking a couple of papers which I've described as programmatic. Obviously, these days, in the era of the Red Book and the era of the Black Books, we're interested in another side of Jung. But Jung can be incredibly crisp, incredibly programmatic. I think he says things in these papers that actually absolutely link in with the Red Book and the Black Books. But common to both of them is that he uses this word Weltanschauung and puts it in the title. And as you can see, he's trying to explain how analytical psychology has this very important philosophical dimension to it. So we'll have a look at the first passage as we go on to the next slide. So here we are in volume 8, and I'll just take us through this passage. It starts off by Jung telling us that we live as if we're walking in shoes too small for them. We're not comfortable, and it seems to me that this is a common theme to both Jung and Klages, is that we're not really comfortable in the way that we find ourselves. We feel ourselves hemmed in. In fact, this is an expression that he uses just a few lines down. Jung says that quality of eternity, okay, what we see when we look through out into the cosmos, that quality of eternity, so characteristic of the life of primitive man, primitive humankind. Mensch is an inclusive term. It's much more gender correct in German if we look at the word Mensch. So characteristic of the life of the primitive human being is entirely lacking. And again, there's that sense of, are we able to intuit the eternal in the finite, in the everyday, is one of the great ideas, I think, that Jung, as well as other thinkers, are trying to communicate to us. And why is this so? It is because we are hemmed in by rationalistic walls. Hemmed in by rationalistic walls which cut us off from this eternity of nature. You see here this beautiful pair of opposites of ratio and nature. And this looks as if Jung is going to be very anti-rational, but I don't think that's the case, because we can look at other parts of his work. He does have a critique of reason, but that doesn't make him an irrationalist, which of course is what so many of his enemies, so many of his detractors want to persuade us. What analytical psychology says it's trying to do is to break through these walls. We have this great image here of reconstruction, of archaeology, so digging through. We're trying to restructure the world in which we find ourselves. And it is engaged on this archaeological project of what he says as is digging up again the fantasy images of the unconscious, which our rationalism has rejected. Of course, that takes off in the whole direction of the Red Book and so on, but just think of it in this terms of a critique of ratio. The images, he says, lie beyond the walls, again, a bit like that picture that we saw of the medieval woodcut. And yet, they're beyond the walls because they are part of the nature in us. This great key psychoanalytic idea, we find it in Freud, but we find it, in fact, first with Jung. Freud, I think, really nicks it from Jung. We find it, interestingly, in the Frankfurt School as well. The Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer, the tradition that didn't want to have anything to do with Jung, but they've exactly got the same idea of die Natur in uns. These images are within us, but what is within us lies buried in our past. And it's something against which he says, again, this image of the barrier, something we've barricaded ourselves behind the walls of reason. But notice what he then says. Analytical psychology tries to resolve the resultant conflict, not by going back to nature with Rousseau. Leave aside the question as to whether he's doing Rousseau injustice in describing it as that. I think he's fairly on the button with it, actually. But he's saying, this is not a retrogressive. Analytical psychology is not a retrogressive or regressive program. It's doing something else. Look how he describes it. He says, we hold on to the level of reason we've successfully reached. So this is not anti-rational, but it's about supplementing rationality. He says, we enrich consciousness with the knowledge of humankind's psychic foundations. And again, we've got a lot of imagery here of construction, of architecture and archaeology. As we'll see, we find that in Klages as well. Moving on to the next slide then, please. Again, the same problematic approached in a slightly different way in this passage here, where Jung starts off by talking about, well, it's all very well appealing to reason, he says, and that would be fine if human beings were by nature rational animals, but they're not. And if there's one thing that the age of Zoom has surely confirmed to us, is that we're not rational at all. On the contrary, he says, human beings are quite as much irrational. He's not celebrating that. He's simply saying that's a fact. How are we going to deal with it? That's why he says reason is not sufficient to modify instinct and make it conform to the rational order. So reason is insufficient. It's not that it's merely inherently problematic. It's fine as long as it is being used, as it were, as the right kind of tool. And he goes on to say that all the contemporary problems, all the philosophical and religious questions of our day raked up, unless either the psychotherapist or the patient abandons the attempt in time, it's likely to get under both their skins. Each will be driven to a discussion of their philosophy of life, both with themselves and with the partner. And of course, this idea of Lebensphilosophie, also possibly translated as vitalism. The two traditions, there's not a linguistic connection between them, but very much a conceptual one. And here we have Jung saying that what we have to do is to pay attention to our Philosophie des Lebens, our Lebensphilosophie. And Klages is very explicitly in this tradition of Lebensphilosophie as well. Jung, you can see, is also perfectly compatible with it as well. Okay, keeping an eye on the clock, we're okay. Let's just move on to our next extract. Here Jung says, and he reminds us that this very modern problematic, modern for him, postmodern maybe for us, is not a new one. And he talks about how medieval physicians realized that there was a problem by practicing a philosophy whose roots can be traced back to pre-Christian times. And I think we'll find this with Klages as well, an interest in going back beyond the Christian, not simply to be anti-Christian, but simply because you're trying to get back down as far as you can, and that inevitably brings you to the pagan, whose nature exactly corresponds to our experience with patients, clients, I suppose you'd say, today. And how can they do that? Because they recognize, beside the light of divine revelation, another source, a lumen naturae, this great term, which of course is used by Paracelsus. And the whole question of how Paracelsus and medieval thinkers are received by Jung and Klages is another fascinating area that one would be able to explore. So we don't just have the light of divine revelation, but we don't just have rationality, we have this lumen naturae, whatever that might be, as well. Okay, let's move on and have a look at a couple of bits from Klages. There's a big book by Klages called Degeist als Widersacher der Seele. The so hard to translate. We ought to talk about this when we get to that. The spirit as the enemy of the soul is one way of translating it. That's the big book. Only available in German. There are a few essays which are available in translation. But what I wanted to do, rather than take us from our programmatic statements, was to keep up with this idea of Weltanschauung and take an extract from a late work by Klages called Rhythmen und Runen, so Rhythms and Runes, and whose subtitle is an important one. It is The Nachlass, the literary remains, edited by himself. It's not usual to edit your own literary remains. It's typical of how quirky and how unusual Klages is. It also points to a bigger problem with Klages as well, that it was probably no one who was going to edit his literary remains for him. Maybe in some ways that's a blessing in disguise. We know that getting your sister to edit your literary remains is a big problem if you're called Nietzsche. But this is a fascinating book which deals with extracts that were hitherto unpublished, and he gives us this great foreword, and I wanted to share this with you. The boundaries of blood and race. We've got problems there, haven't we? We've got problems with those terms. Let's not pretend we don't have difficulties with Klages or with Jung, actually. But we can maybe come back and talk about them. The boundaries of blood and race, of cults and symbols, that's maybe a bit better, of customs and arts of the hearth have all been torn down. So we have this sense of same sort of mood, but more radical than we saw in that passage where Jung was talking about how we feel hemmed in. He says the consuming fire of capitalism is spreading in an unbridled, raving way, strangling the elements and swallowing into nothingness woods, animals, and hearts that love a song. So we have a critique of capitalism as essentially inhuman. And we also see here a note which Klages sounds, which we could describe as ecological. And we've got the COP26 coming up in Glasgow. Wonder if anybody's going to be referring to Klages at it. Probably not, but a lot of ecological thought can be found to have its roots in Klages as well. Unstoppably older humankind, the primordial life of the planet is disappearing. Already the day is oppressively close when, as if robbed of the nourishing food of the soul, the interlude of thinking reason, there we are, back to this critique of rationalism, or instrumental rationalism, as Adorno would call it. That interlude of thinking reason will grow tired. And with the epoch of the post-historical, no longer humans, instead automata, the final act, that of coming to an end, will begin. And the sense of coming to an end, which is so very, very strong in Klages, is of course there in the recent study that Peter Kingsley has published about Carl Jung, which is Catafalque, Carl Jung and the End of Humanity. So Kingsley's sounding a very Klagesian kind of note there in his discussion of Jung. Seeing that ahead of me is inescapable. And now we have this interesting little maneuver that Klages does. He says, you know, it's all falling apart, it's all going down the drain, a sentiment one might have felt over this last year at various times. But what does he do? He says, I grasped it was my destiny to set up a monument to life. And there we have that, I think, a nice way of seeing his work, a monument to life. And notice how he says he's going to do it. It's going to look after the sacred fire in the innermost sanctum from which the songs of my youth is issued, around which the steep walls of knowledge would close. So same imagery that we found earlier on with Jung, crowned with Gorgonian signs of mysticism, but which would turn outside the conviction-freezing bastions of conviction on which understanding is dashed. He says his work is meant to be a castle of Troy. Okay, again, this architectural imagery of shudders from the primordial world. The word there is shah, under the dome of eternity. And he says that what he's trying to do is to present his work as a treasure house and arsenal for the initiated. In the event that after the winter of the ages, so there is some hope, not a lot of it, but a little glimmer of hope there should follow a new spring. On to the next slide, please. Well, how do we get to the new spring? How do we get to the to the better weather, if you like? Well, what I'm going to propose is the key linking idea between Jung and Klages is this idea of a symbol. And it seems to me that we can understand the whole thing that's been going on with the arts and humanities over the last 100 years in terms of a battle between two approaches, one which is symbolic and the other which is semiotic. And really the semiotic way won out to all intents and purposes, and maybe that's why arts and humanities are in the state they are today. We've lost this symbolic dimension. And I've given us this quotation of a symbol, which we can come back and talk to, because of course it's a big question, what is a symbol? But it seems to me to nicely get at what interests Jung and Klages, which is when Goethe, a major reference point for both thinkers, says this: the symbol is the thing without being the thing, and yet it is the thing. It's a lovely little Denk maneuver that he performs there. And I think it's common to the way that Klages and Jung talk about the symbol as well. Go on to the next slide, please. Well, I'd move through this quickly because I don't want to open up the entire can of worms or Pandora's box about what an archetype is. But let's say that there is a storehouse of archetypes. There is a kind of categorization of archetypes. I've listed the common ones that are there. One of these two questions, it seems to me, is what's the interrelation between the between the individual archetypes. So those are the archetypes that Jung proposes. What does Klages offer us in terms of symbols? If we go to the next slide. There we go. Thank you very much. Klages talks about them not simply as symbols, but he talks about them as being primordial images. Complicated word. Primordial images, so much easier in German. It's Urbild. He talks about the Urbilder, which is, of course, the first term that Jung used when talking about the archetypes. There's a major terminological shift that takes place, it seems to me, in Jung's thinking, when he stops talking about the Urbild and starts talking about the archetype for interesting and I think significantly strategic reasons. Klages talks about the Urbild, and these, you can say, are very different, except not entirely. He talks about the moon, he talks about water, he talks about the tree. Well, Jung's interested in that as well. In fact, many of these symbols are commented upon in Jung's first work, Transformations and Symbols of the Libido. And then finally, the Magna Mater, and that seems to be one of great points of crossover between our two thinkers, the mother archetype, the great mother, and Bachhofen is obviously there in the background as the great link between the two of them. Okay, we'll come back and talk about this. We'll move on to the next slide, please. And we're nearly there. Be really interested in your questions and comments on all of this. Just to summarize some of the points of similarity, as I've been emphasizing, I think there is this difficult question that both Jung and Klages are trying to negotiate of the relation between rationality and the irrational or the non-rational and the supra-rational. And in many ways, that's still such a mega question, which is kind of the elephant in the room in the arts and humanities today. There is the way in which both of them belong to a vitalist tradition. In fact, if you remember, Richard Knowles says that Jung is an out-and-out vitalist, but we can reframe that question in terms of what is their indebtedness to the tradition of Lebensphilosophie. Certainly for both of them, there is the appreciation of the archaic, that this category, which is so fascinating, and on which Leslie Gardner has organized some fascinating conferences and seminars in London about. They really love the archaic because it is speaking to something that's within us. But as a result, both of them find themselves pretty much on the margins of the academy. It's for a long time been difficult, I think, to talk about Jung. There are exceptions. You've got the Department of Psychology and Psychosocial Studies at Essex, for example. But with these points of exception, they are very largely on the margins. And Klages is so on the margins, he's absolutely fallen off, and is rarely, if ever, referenced. And I think that's a big loss in my view. Points of difference between them. As we've seen, I think Klages strikes an immediately much more pessimistic note. With Jung, I think there's always the sense of, well, something's going wrong, but we can fix it, or but there is a way that there is a sense of being able to respond constructively to it. Remember that great remark that Jung makes about the Red Book as being the cathedral for the soul, which each of us can go and build. There's the question of institutionalization versus the lone scholar. Jung, at a very early stage, moves to institutionalize his work. He sets up the Psychological Club, and then some other people come along and set up the Jung Institute and the global network of Jung Institutes. That all means his work has an institutional foundation and mitigates the fact that it's very often outside the academy. But there is only one Ludwig Klages. Klages is, as we've seen, Manu edits his own book as a bit of Johnny No Mates in a way. It's not entirely true, because he did have some followers, but he was never institutionalized, and there was never really a Klages Schule. And that, I think, has been a big problem for him. Finally, the issue of translatability and interculturality. Klages is incredibly difficult to translate. There's recently been a translation that's been made, published in Theon Verlag of Klages' great book of cosmogonic eros. And when looking at it and when translating Klages myself, it really is a tough job. And the translation of cosmogonic eros, I think, is a pretty good one. It's almost though, and it has bedeviled his reception, it's hard to get Klages across in a way which doesn't address the very precise and technical and quite idiosyncratic terminology that he has. But it's worth it. Of course, you can just go off and learn German. I would say that as a Germanist. Finally, the question of interculturality. And I think that all of this stuff, paradoxically, the untranslatability works in Klages' favor, because I feel much more comfortable talking about the archaic in English than I do in German. There are unfortunate resonances that are around some of this material, which is much bigger problem, I think, in as it were, in the German cultural world than it is in the Anglo-American one. And that question of intercultural issues that are with these thinkers, that's actually something where Klages benefits from being read in English, I would say. And that takes us on to our final slide. This is the further reading. There's the translation I was just talking about of Cosmogonic Eros, published by Theon. My own contribution has been to put together the Ludwig Klages and the philosophy of life. As well, what it says is it's a toolkit to help you to understand things. Help you understand Klages at any rate. An older book, Ludwig Klages, The Science of Character. It's out of print. It is floating around on the internet, and it is, I understand, going to be republished at some time. And just a little warning note about the translations published by Archetypes. There are a couple of little collections of books, which actually, as books, are very, very nice, but slightly tendentious in terms of the choice of texts, and definitely tendentious in choice in terms of the editorial view that's pushed by Archetypes, which is it is a far right publisher, intellectual right, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't do Klages any help at all. So that's why my recommendations were around a book you can find on the internet, a new translation of Cosmogonic Eros, and shamelessly pushing the toolkit as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. I have two comments at the beginning, and then we start with the questions. There's one thing, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that Klages lived in Kirchberg.
Yeah.
And he is buried there as well.
Indeed he is, yeah, that's absolutely right.
And this is why I'm mentioning is he's married on the same place of Thomas Mann.
Indeed.
And Thomas Mann wrote his Jung book, one can say, in Küsnacht, just above the Konrad Ferdinand Meyer house. This is not a coincidence, yes.
No, absolutely not. And you're right to suggest that there are all kinds of connections that were going on at that time and in that Kulturkreis, if you want to call that as well. Yeah. And Thomas Mann read Klages, some of Klages at any rate.
Yeah. I mean, when I read the first part of Mann's Opus Magnum, what's it called? Jesus.
He's got so many.
No, the big one.
Joseph
and seine Brüder, exactly. Yeah. Then the first part is like reading Jung, so you must be quite close to it, to the philosophy. Yeah. And did both move there by accident? And Wolfgang Pauli lived the next door to Jung. Strange somehow. That's only.
Well, I think you're right. There are kind of synergistic energies that are moving there between them. One explanation might be that they are kind of both pushed out by the centrifugal forces that get them out of Germany. So, you know, as with anything, there's a push and a pull, and the pull, I suppose, is the intellectual life of Zurich, but there were also things pushing them out of Germany as well.
But this is my second comment or question rather. Klages has he's somehow looked at being anti-Semitic or pro-Nazi in a way. So we might have the same problems that Jung had at the beginning.
You're absolutely right that the reputation of both these thinkers is bedeviled by this question of anti-Semitism, and it is one of the big problems that if you try to talk about them within the academy, this is brought up and it blocks the discussion. Well, we can talk about Jung. I'll try and exculpate Klages to the extent not so much of exculpating him, but I don't think he's a fundamentally anti-Semitic thinker in the sense that anti-Semitism is built into his system, and I don't think that's the case with Jung either. It's certainly true. One of the big problems that Klages has is, and it comes later in this foreword that I was talking to about Rüttmann und Runen, is when he uses, talking about Alfred Schuler, he uses anti-Semitic terms. I think really partly because he wants to get his book published and partly because he wants to get out of his exile in Switzerland. That's not to excuse him. That's not really to, in the full sense of the word, exculpate him. I think I sometimes wonder what's worse, to be an anti-Semite who says anti-Semitic things, or to be somebody who isn't an anti-Semite and to say anti-Semitic things. You're not even saying what you're believing. And I think it's the latter category. He is using it for political instrumental, but personal political instrumental purposes. That said, you can see that any critique of Judeo-Christianity is going to have to negotiate this very, very complex and difficult question of how do you propose the pagan without falling into the accusation of being anti-Semitic. So what I'd say in summary is I can see there are problems. I wouldn't want to deny that they're there, but I would want to contextualize them and say and you just look at Degeist und Widersacher der Seele and you look at its 1,500 pages.
Oh Jesus!
You've got to do a lot of trawling through it to get to problematic passages. Now, the problematic passages are there. Then for me, the question is, it's like Paul de Man, who's had the same issues with many thinkers. Is that structurally inherent in the thought, or is it something where you have to say it's an oversight, or it is a lack of understanding, or it does reflect prejudices which are typical of particular of their time. So that's in no way to minimize that problem, but if I thought that these thinkers, if I thought that Jung, Klages were structurally anti-Semitic, then I don't think I'd want to work on them.
Okay, coming to the questions, yes. The first one, a couple of them actually. The first one is from Adam Wetterhahn from Phoenix, Arizona. He asked along my line, were there any contacts between Klages and Henri Bergson?
Oh, very interesting question. I don't think that that there are. Have to have a look in that. Of course, Jung pops in a couple of references to Bergson from time to time, doesn't he? Including in the Red Book. I need to go back and look and see whether Klages directly draws on Bergson, or whether he would have found Bergson via another route. I'm just wondering how well known was Bergson in German-speaking Europe at the time. So I'd need to go and look at that. And Adam, if you drop me an email, paul.bishop@glasgow.ac.uk. I'll try and get a better answer for it. But Beckson's not a major thinker on the Klargesian horizon, I can say that much.
There's another one from Adam. You mentioned Klages as working with primordial symbols. Does he arrange these meaning-rich symbols into a mandala, quaternity, or other systems for applications by others, or is it more so incumbent upon the individual to develop their own Urbild?
Very good.
Arrangement of symbols.
Yeah, very good question. I think I'd say there's a difference in the function, in the orbit between Jung and Klages. That is to say, as I understand Jung's argument about the archetypes, is that they constellate themselves in a particular sequence, and in fact that Jung's entire emphasis is on sequentiality and development, and that maybe marks him out as being slightly different from Freud in that point of view. That's why Jung's like sequences of visions, sequences of dreams. And then the interesting question is, well, what should the order of the archetypes be? I suppose the self is going to be the ultimate one that you're aiming for, but it's the sequentiality that's important. With Klages, I think, and that's why there's a relative paucity of Urbilder that he points to, is that it's not the sequence, but it's the particular moment when you become aware of the Urbild. What does that mean? And I think if we go back, think about the example that he talks about the tree, and the Urbild is a really tricky concept in Klages, but I think he understands it like this: that it's about not looking at the tree. It's not simply ein Sehen, but it is ein Schauen. It is a contemplation, and it is therefore about seeing the tree in a different way than you will ordinarily see it. And so he gives the example of in one of his works,
seeing the tree as in the quote from Goethe.
Yes, yeah. So he talks about, for example, you can see a wood, and you can think about it as a capitalist would, is that you would think about, oh, well, I could sell this land for so many dollars or Schweizer Franken or whatever. Or you could think of the wood that you can cut it down, and this is the amount of money that I would make by selling all of this wood for stoves or whatever. Or you could look at it as a botanist would and say, well, a very fine collection of whatever particular trees that they might be, and natural habitat and so on. And he says, but you could also look at it. So all these very strategic ways of looking at it, chopping it up or using it for your research or other kinds of practical purposes. But he says, if you were one evening at sunset to see that wood with the setting sun behind it, lit up by the bright rays of the sunshine, you would be arrested by it, ergriffen. Another great key word. You would be ergriffen by it, and you would see it as an Urbild. And that moment, that experiential moment, I think, is so intense, or can be so intense, that it has this function of taking you out of yourself, taking out of this calculating, instrumental, rationalistic approach to the wood, and seeing it as an Urbild. And I think that's why what's important then are these moments when, like again in that woodcut, you stick your wood through, you stick your head through, and you suddenly see the cosmos. How can we have a culture in which there are moments where, as the old saying goes, what is this life full of care? We have no time to stand and stare. What is this life full of care? We have no time for the Urbild. And I think that's how the Urbild is meant to function for Klages.
This would be a luminous experience.
Yeah.
Okay, there are 2 or even 3 questions by Leslie Gardner. The first one is this idea of past primordial, where is past in us? because we are here now, that's always present. Primordial in us, the past in us. How can we hold that? Contexts are always now and cannot be ever as past. Is this a kind of essentialist idea of past? Can it ever be that the past is in us?
Very, very good question, Leslie. Thanks for that. Well, that is really the $6 million question about the archaic, isn't it? I suppose one answer is simply to say is, well, you know when you're in the archaic. it's a bit like Jung's Red Book. You know when you're with the collective unconscious. Again, there's that experiential dimension there. I suppose this question of it being within us is going to have to be explained in Jungian terms by the idea of a collective unconscious. Klages' equivalent to that is slightly different, because Klages is going to be not introducing the idea of the collective unconscious, but really trying to relativize our conscious apprehension. And he would see that our conscious apprehension as being part of the mechanism that he calls Geist, that he calls spirit. And in terms of the way things stack up in Klages, Geist and spirit comes down on the negative side. The positive side is Seele. And that's therefore a much more affective, intuitive, numinous kind of apprehension. And what Klages is trying to do is where do we see this archaic? Where do we see this primordial? Is in the form of monuments, or in the form of other cultures, or in the form of landscape. And his argument is, you know it when you see it, and you've got to open yourself up to seeing it. And you must not allow the rationalistic, calculating, bean counting kind of mentality to push that out of your life. And that's why there is this, I think, very important practical aspect. What Klages is trying to do is to say, in a way, the archaic is all around you. I mean, and the experiences we've had this last year have been incredible in terms of revealing archaic dimensions to life. Feelings of technology is great, I think, at communicating a sense of abandonment and isolation more than one would ordinarily be able to suffer. So where is it? It's all around us. It's in us, and of course there is archaic dimension to ourselves in terms of our history. And it's not simply giving oneself uncritically over to that, but it's being able to maintain an appreciation for that dimension. Does that answer the question, Leslie? It's the best that I could do.
Okay. She made a comment on your comment. Wait a minute. No. That, by the way, Paul mentioned our classicist and depth psychology conferences. The next one coming up is mid-September. And then she gives a link. That's only a comment by her. There's another comment by Raymond Harrison. He quotes William Blake. A fool sees not the same tree a wise man sees.
Oh, beautiful. Oh, that is just a fantastic quotation. Of course, Jung is a great lover of Blake. I think Klages does quote so many people. I mean, just in the same way that Transformations and Symbols of Libido, or in fact, the 20 volumes of the collected works of Jung are a little education in themselves. I think there's a similar kind of function with Klages. You learn so much from him. And one of the main resources that Klages draws on, again, like Jung, is going to be the pre-Socratics. Again, like Jung, it's not going to be Plato for the most part. And then it's the tradition of German Romanticism. And in terms of that really excellent Blake quotation, which I'm noting down because I just want to go and think about that later. Blake, of course, he's not a German romantic, but he's in that romantic tradition, and it absolutely makes that point. Klages, I think, sees himself as being, one of the last romantics before this tradition disappears. And I think it's one of the things which I quite like. That I find it quite moving, that elegiac tone that's there in Klages, is the sense of that we are just on the cusp. Of course, he's writing about 100 years ago. We're probably over the edge now. We're just on the cusp of losing things when they will never be retrievable again. And yet, what is it? His response is not simply to throw up his hands in despair, but to work and labor and understand. And the 9 volumes of his Sämtliche Werke are very much a testament to that, just as the 20 volumes are in the case of Jung.
There's another comment from Adam in Phoenix. The concept of the archaic reminds me deeply of the work of Jean Gibson with his mutations of consciousness.
Excellent. Yes, very, very, very good point. And Jean Gibson, I think, is another thinker who, for the most part, has kind of fallen out of the picture as far as the academy is concerned. Gibson, I have read. I find him very, 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 very helpful. And do get in touch with me, Adam, because I'd like to share some work that I've written around Gibson in relation to this. And I think that's absolutely right. The one thinker, I think, in this tradition who's kind of made it onto the reading lists, or he's probably been taken off them again, was Ernst Cassirer. And Ernst Cassirer, even if he doesn't have the same concept of the symbolic, he is appreciative, I think, of this tradition. It shows that you can be Jewish and work very happily with the idea of the symbolic. There's nothing inherently anti-Semitic in the idea of the conception of the symbolic. And I think there are also passages in volume 2 of the philosophy of symbolic forms, when Cassirer talks. The second volume is about mythical consciousness. And there's some great passages where he evokes what the mythical consciousness means in ways that I think are very, very close to what Gibson and Jung and indeed Klages are talking about as well.
Okay, one last, I think we are done. There are no more questions, only a comment by Tam McAdams. Thank you, Paul, for your contributions in carrying on the works of Klages. Thank you from all of us.
Well, thank you very much for that for that very kind comment in doing that. I mean, what I'd love people to take away from this evening is the sense of that there is something to go and work with Klages. I think that he shows up, and particularly if people are coming at it from a Jungian point of view. It's not that he's a corrective to Jung, but in some way he's a supplement. Equally, I think Jung supplements a lot of the ideas that are with Klages, and it's up to us as the next generation to bring these two great thinkers into a dialogue with each other, a dialogue which the two of them themselves never got, apart from their meeting in Zurich town centre. Jung does mention Klages a couple of times. He mentions him in Wotan, the essay Wotan of 1936, but it's pretty dismissively, and there's no evidence of a completely deep engagement with him. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is simply because, well, you're young, you've got your 20 collected works to be getting on with, you've got lectures to give, papers to give, clients to see, patients to see, and so on and so forth. Read books to paint and so on. So that must take away the time. But I would like to see Jung brought into contact with Klages, and indeed other thinkers. Rudolf Steiner. I think if we're going to be full out controversial, then let's get Rudolf Steiner in there as well. See somebody shaking their head, but I think these figures, they're not going to be looked at in the academy. So you might as well dive deep into all of them. And once reputation's gone, then you can look at all of these thinkers, because I think they're so interesting.
Can I make one comment? You'll excuse me, Bernhard. Part of my background for a very long time in musicology was I tended to be very sort of French post-structuralist, which will ultimately land in Deleuze and Guattari, who will then return to Jung and a wide variety of people. And that classic lecture I teach every year where we're talking about structuralism and non-structuralism and that kind of thing, the point where things are splitting into, do we look at patterns or do we look at essences, the phenomenologists and all this? And the grandeur and intensity of a lot of philosophy and thought that ends up getting a bit tied to Nazism and then sort of vanishes. It has come back in a variety of ways in the past 40 years. Even Cassirer, by the way, one of Cassirer's major students, and my mind has just completely gone blank, Feeling and Form, Philosophy in a New Key.
Suzanne Langer.
Thank you, thank you. Langer is read by my students and many music students. Is that merely a specialization? There's a question of, as Jungians, we're holding on to a sense of bigness and intensity and resonance that has, it's not lost to the academy, but it's still not very central. You know, it's been sort of pushed away for 60 or 70 years.
Yeah.
Do you see coming changes in that?
Well, that's a very interesting comment that you've made there, Paul. I tell you, my eye has just lighted on something on the chat, which I'll come to before I come to this, which is just to say that no, Klages doesn't really reference Jung. He mentions in the very early essay talk that he gives, but there's hardly ever any referencing by Jung or of Jung in Klages' writings. So that was an easy question. Yours, Paul, was so much more difficult. So I just wanted a bit more.
Apologies.
I just wanted a bit more time to think about it. Right. Well, first of all, I think that I can see that in an area like music or musicology, Klages would be a very useful thinker because of his notion of rhythm. And one of the great divisions that Klages makes is between this idea of takt, which is indexed to Degeist, so regularity, a kind of monotonous machine-like beat, and on the other hand, rhythm, where there is a pattern, but there's variety built into the pattern. And if you didn't have variety built into the pattern, it wouldn't be rhythm, it would be takt. So what is it? That kind of elasticity, that's what Klages says is, he says that's life. Life which has this rhythm, which has this push and pull. So I can see that in areas like musicology, this tradition would still work. I think it's much more harder for the philosophical tradition. Of course, very few people talk about Deleuze's early interest in Jung. I mean, there's a great book by Christian Kerslake, which very clearly goes into that. And of course, the post-structuralist critique of reason and rationality easily accommodates itself, I think, to a Jungian reading, just in the same way that the Frankfurt School and critical theory in general can coexist very happily with Jung, but it doesn't. And I think part of this comes down to academics always wanting to see things on their own terms, but it also comes down, I think, to this question of, well, if you can have, is there any difference between, let's put it crudely, a right-wing critique of rationality and a left-wing critique? It's hard to. You certainly can, I think, really put Jung and Klages on the left. I think it's unfair to put them on the extreme right. But they're coming from different angles: a conservative and a progressive. You've got this critique of rationality. Surely that's the most important thing: is to tease out what would the practical implications of that be. Do I see it changing? Well, it's so hard at the moment to predict when almost everything seems to be changing. Just to draw attention to, in case people didn't know it, a little piece that was published at the beginning of this whole pandemic crisis by Giorgio Agamben, who represents, I suppose, the next phase or the post-next phase of critical theory, about what's happening to the academy and about what's happening. And let's just say it doesn't look very good.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before we close, one comment. Paul Atinello, that is, will host on the 14th July, 14 juillet, Kevin Liu as our next speaker with the topic of race and Jung. So thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for taking part in our endeavor. And
it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening and participating in that.
Thank you very much indeed. And as I say, I'm clapping you because you've sat through it all, and it's been very nice to meet some of you and see some of you again. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.